you are all very brave. If you thought we were going to talk about economics, like we're going to talk about the stock market, or how to make money, or maybe that's why you did come. If you thought we were going to talk about things and those things and you still came, I appreciate your vote of confidence. But you might still have the question of, must we talk about economics? Right? Why do we want to talk about economics? And it's interesting because I looked for material on a Christian basis for economics, right? So I'm not talking about personal finances. I'm not talking about like supply and demand kind of things. I'm talking about the basis for those things. And I actually couldn't find a lot of material on that topic. And so I started kind of my own, and then I found something which you guys should be very thankful for because I used more of that than of my own material. And it was very helpful. So it's actually a very unique topic, and I don't understand why we don't talk about the basis for economics. What are the biblical foundations for economic thinking? I don't know why we don't talk about that more, because certainly the Bible talks about it quite a bit, right? So when I say the word economics, I'm talking about this. I found a lot of different definitions for economics. The one I like, the one that is most general, the one that keeps us from like looking at spreadsheets or something like that, is this: the study of human choices under conditions of scarcity. Right? How do people make decisions based on limited resources that we have? That's certainly a topic in the Bible, right? How do individuals do that? Now, we're going to not actually be studying like the choices they make, the actual economics. We're going to be talking about biblical foundations for economics. And it's actually interesting because in our personal life, things are easy to apply. Things that are actually economic principles are: you shall not covet, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't kill, right? Slavery. Those are economic ideas that are bad. And in our own personal life, it's easy to apply Scripture. I know what it means for me to steal and for me to covet. I'm going to not do that. Well, but economics applies to us as individuals, families, corporations, right? Businesses, communities, nations. And then my proposition to you is, it's just as easy to apply, but it gets complicated and people get confused either willingly or unwillingly to apply the exact same principles at those different levels. Now the word economic is from the Greek word oikos. It's in the Bible. It's talking about a household. So a household, not necessarily the building, but a household, a person who's managing their house, all the affairs of their house. It's oikos. And nomos, which is law, how it's governed. How does someone govern their house? What are the ways in which we should govern, or what are the laws that we should govern all our interactions? If it's a house, who's buying the groceries? How much are we going to budget for groceries? Those type of things. If it's a business, how much are things costing versus it? If it's a nation, what are policies that are just, right? And you might say, well, if you're going to talk about politics, and I'm not going to talk about politics, I promise you. So, but you might bring up politics, because if some of these things conflict with political views, it's you bringing up politics. And I think you should evaluate those kind of views. And I understand you say, I understand not being interested in politics. I'm not actually interested in politics. But policies that are implemented aren't politics. They're not the same thing. Policies are about justice. And Christians are interested in justice. So you have to consider, if you're not interested in justice beyond my own personal interactions with my friends, why is that? And that's because the Bible's very interested in justice. and the idea that we can bring about like human flourishing. And I have other questions. I was going to go on, but there's like, why would I be interested in that? So why is the topic of economics of interest enough to talk about it for the next couple of weeks? There's some questions that we can answer using economic principles. So what is the role of self-interest in the Christian life? Grant was asking about that. We're not going to get that tonight, but what is self-interest? Is self-interest a bad thing? How do I differentiate self-interest from selfishness or greed? There's certainly a lot of things that are self-interested that doesn't mean they're bad. To a Christian, what is self-interest? How do I distinguish between self-interest and selfishness? And like from an economic standpoint, the difference is if I'm looking at a pie, people talk about an economic standpoint, I want to take a piece of the pie, and I want to take your piece of the pie, too. That's selfish, right? But I want to do something that makes a bigger pie for all of us. Those are two separate economic directions that you can be taking. One is good and one is not. And the difference between selfishness and self-interest is a part of that. Another question you might ask, that you might use economics to answer, is what is the distinction between biblical human flourishing and cultural definitions of flourishing? And I'm not going to talk about this one because Reagan talked about it a little bit. How we define not just things that make me happy, having more stuff, but actually, am I making God-honoring decisions? Am I flourishing? Am I honoring and managing my house the way in a God-honoring way? Another question you might ask is, what actions make people flourish? What makes them poor? The Bible talks about the poor, poverty. The poor over 500 times. The Bible uses the word poverty and how to avoid it dozens of times. The Bible talks about wealth and riches 200 times, over 200 times. The Bible talks about work and labor 800 times. Over 800 times it talks about that. So what makes people flourish? What makes them wealthy as a group? What makes them poor? So we can look at individual level and say, well, here's the things that make me poor. I quit my job, I sit at home, I don't work, right? Well, prior to this year, that would have made you poor. This year, that's okay, right? So those are things individually that make me poor, but what about as a nation, as we expand, as we aggregate to 300 million people? What makes 300 million people poor and what makes them flourish? The Bible talks about those things in economic terms. How do I evaluate cultural and political trends and issues like social justice, minimum wage laws, inflation, perceived evils of like disparity? How do I evaluate those things? What are tools that I would use to evaluate? Someone talks about justice, that sounds good. And I can tell you, like in terms of social justice, woke theologians will consider it unspiritual. You're not spiritually minded if you're concerned about economics. But then if you consider what someone who is proposing like disparity, problems of disparity, they're actually proposing economic solutions, right? Anyone that's would bring about these kind of topics and have a solution, it will always be an economic solution. And I think as Christians, we're not very equipped to deal with economic problems, with deciding what is good and what is not good from an economic standpoint. How can secular occupations bring glory to God? That's a question I think has to do with economics. Because that definition is study of human choices in conditions of scarcity. Right? What choices should we be making? It's not just, if you're a minister, that you have to make certain choices. Other people have to make choices. I'm going to give you an example. Here's a guy. His name is Norman Borlaug. Anybody heard of him? He saved 7 billion people. Isn't it amazing that you've never heard of this guy? Right? This guy, in the 70s, people talked about population problems on Earth. Right? There's only so much food. With the number of people that we have, half the population is going to starve. Right? So at one level, that's oh, by the way, I'm going to interrupt myself. I don't have anywhere I have to finish at. So you guys jump in, stop me, interrupt. If you have questions, I can, meander is not probably the right way to put it. Like if this rocket has to land, the trajectory can move around. I don't have to finish anything, so interrupt me, stop. If you have questions, I just don't want to, instead of landing, like bounce off the atmosphere and fly off into space. So keep it somewhat less tangential. Okay, this guy, Norman Borlaug, eliminated world hunger. He was an evangelical Lutheran. What's that? That's you? Okay. Yeah. Okay. He went to India where he solved its food problem. And here was the problem, right? There wasn't enough food. And in India, people were spending 100%, if they were in poverty, they would spend about 100% of what they make on food. This guy went to the University of Minnesota. He failed at his entrance exam, but then he went on, he kept pressing on to get his PhD in plant pathology and genetics. I'm trying to read what he did. Okay, Borlaug was the scientist who launched the Green Revolution. So we're not talking about solar panels, we're talking about food. Green, not environmentalism, but agricultural revolution in the 1970s, on par with the Industrial Revolution. By crossbreeding and genetic study, not genetic modification, Borlaug developed new strains of crop plants that resisted disease and insects, grew better, and produced much greater yields. As a result, combined with innovative farming practices that Borlaug also developed, the global food supply soared. So where there wasn't enough food for, however many people were around in the 70s, and everyone was saying we have to worry about, overpopulation, which they're looking at it from the demand side. There's too much demand for food, we got to get rid of some of these people. Borlaug looked at it from the other side and said we got to get more food, and he made choices that changed the conditions of scarcity and made food more plentiful and brought down to the point where Americans are spending only like 9% of their income on food. And that obviously affected the rest of the world too. I was in a debate with an atheist, an agnostic, and he brought up this guy like this was a great example of science. And I go, well, that's interesting. And I went and looked up the guy. And the guy this was all about his theology of work. This was his offering to God. This was how he filled what we're going to talk about is this cultural mandate we get in Genesis 1. His motivation, science was the tool that he used for sure. And an atheist could have used the same tools. But the why, the purpose, the meaning, he got from his theology, from his Christian theology. Okay, so I wanted to throw that out there as an example. Micah 4, 2-4 talks about this. Right, so in Micah 4, the prophet is imagining, envisioning, or prophesying about a future where the cultural mandate in Genesis to subdue the earth as we're created in the image of God to have dominion over the earth, which we're going to talk about, is fulfilled in a complete way. Right? So Micah 4, I'll give you a couple seconds to get there, is where he talks about how that happens and envisions what that is like. So Micah 4, verse 2, and many nations shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And here's what's going to happen there. That he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law. Right? The law of God is going to be taught from the Jerusalem, and he's going to teach us, and we're going to walk in his ways. And he shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide disputes from strong nations far away. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks, right? These are economic principles too. A lack of war is an economic principle, right? So not killing people for their things is good economics. Killing people for their things is bad economics. So, what's that? Yeah. So there's going to be an end of war, and then nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Neither shall they learn war. They're not even going to study how to conduct war anymore. But every man is going to sit under his own vine in his own fig tree. So these are people are going to own their own ability to sustain themselves, right? This person has his own vine and his own fig tree, and he's secure in his person. No one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. So that is a vision of what a good economics based on biblical principles would get us. Okay, so if you think, well, I don't really, economics doesn't really affect me. We're talking about labor, we're talking about business, we're talking about money, trade, value, how you value things, how you place value on things, property, time, resources, talents, abilities, information, authority that you have, rights that you have, and their corresponding responsibilities, and wisdom. How we manage our lives, our house, our business, and our nation. That's economics. So if you're still thinking you're not interested, there's nothing left in life to, this doesn't get covered by economics. So hopefully that was enough of a sale that you'd want to proceed with me a little bit. Okay, so let's do that. Oh, one more question. How do I love my neighbor? In Leviticus 19, it talks a little bit about that in actually in economic terms. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is this cultural mandate. What I was referring to as a cultural mandate. Have you guys heard that term before? Yeah. Cultural mandate? All right, so Genesis 1, 26 to 28. And we're going to bounce around a little bit. Brings us all the way back to the beginning. Right? Then in verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. When you think about being created in the image of God, what comes to mind? What do you think that means? Do you look like God? Anybody? Really?
Thinking beings. What we think, we have emotions, we have reason.
Yeah, rational or reason, yes. It's definitely an aspect, I think.
With rationality and divinity. So as God rules us, we rule the beasts in the fields and kind of act like the image of God towards the earth, towards the creation.
Okay, that's good. Anything else? The image of God. What does it mean to carry God's image?
How about like a representative?
Yes. Yeah. So it's a job description. Sense, right? Yeah. One of the things that God is described as doing in Genesis 1 is creating. Right? At the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, but at first He's just dealing with raw materials. Now we can't create things out of nothing like God did. But at that point, He took the raw materials and He used them, He arranged them, He gave them meaning, He gave them beauty, He gave them purpose, right? He created mountains, He created things for us, He created things for animals to eat, smash things together, work things out, and create, right? So one aspect that I want to focus on, there's lots of aspects to the idea of the image of God, but one I want to focus on is creativity. That we each have creativity. In that we emulate, and as God created, we are also representatives. We're delegates of God, and it's our job to create in ways. And let's talk about that. I think we can kind of follow Charlie here with what he said. And let them have dominion over the fish, over the birds, over all the livestock of the earth, and over every creeping thing. That's all the categories, the whole taxonomy of animals. You got your fish, you got your birds, you got your livestock, and you got creeping things. Right? That's as detailed as really they got at that time as far as how to arrange animals. So what does it mean to have dominion over those animals, over those categories, or over the earth in general? What do you think that's talking about? It's really kind of fascinating.
Like you're ruling over.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying like, they're like your subjects, well, maybe I am in a way, but like that's your domain.
Yeah.
Like all the rules that, if it's your domain, it all obeys your rule.
Yeah. Great.
We're in charge of stewarding what God has given us, so we use it in an economic way, in
Yeah.
a wise way to
Yeah.
advance and glorify God.
Yes, very good. Yep, that's true. To have dominion over something. I looked up how the word is used in other areas, and it's kind of interesting. So Numbers 24:19 uses the word exercise dominion, and every time it's used in the Old Testament from a person, like having dominion over another person, it's kind of violent. So that was interesting. So if you're subjugating a people and taking over their city in Numbers 24:9, it's actually talking about killing the people and exercising dominion over them and destroying their cities. Okay? So when it's talking about a person, it has a violent kind of connotation. So there's no one, it's not talking about people, so don't worry, it's not, our command isn't to be violent. It's not talking about people in Genesis 1. It's talking about people exercising dominion over other things. And they're not things that we can be violent in a moral way against. But it's interesting, the meaning of that word, because it's also used in Judges 14:9. And this is kind of interesting here. Okay, this is Samson. He's messing around, and he finds a lion carcass, right? And in Judges 14:9, he says this: he scraped it out into his hands and went on eating it as he went. And he came to his father and his mother and gave some to them, and they ate, but he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of the lion. So Samson got some honey, he scraped
For
it
a
out of the
second,
carcass.
I thought he was eating the lion. I'm like, he's eating the lion? Is that
No,
what
I'm
you
sorry.
said?
I could have read the verse 4 and it would have helped a little bit.
I thought it was the
Verse
honey,
4.
not the lion. I'm
Right.
like, what?
He found a lion carcass. I couldn't explain that better. And there was honey in it, and he scraped out the honey outside of the lion carcass, and then he kept that for himself, and then he gave some of the honey to his parents.
There you go.
So what, yes, sorry about that. So, now normally, what happens when I'm doing this is you read that verse and it doesn't make any sense, and you're like, Steve, you gave us the wrong verse again, right? But I got the right verse this time, because the word he scraped it out is the same word. He had a lion carcass and he scraped the valuable honey out of the carcass. It's actually the same Hebrew word, right? So when it's used people, it's talking about like subjugating people. It can even have a violent connotation. It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. When it's used about like some kind of raw material, it's talking about extracting, scraping something out of. So when it's used in Genesis 1, I think it's talking about our relationship to the earth. Is the earth is there, that we have to scrape the value out of it. And I don't mean like, oh, we could do a copper mine and we should go mining for copper and get copper out. But that might be included, right? And I think it's more about our relationship to creation. That the earth is here for us. Our mandate here is to extract value out of the earth for each other. Right? That's our mandate, and that includes animals. That includes what Norman Borlaug did with plants. That probably does include copper mining and things like that. Now, am I saying that I'm not saying the earth is disposable, we just need to get everything out of it and chuck it, right? I'm saying our relationship, we're not here for the earth is here for us. We exercise dominion over it. Did that make sense? Okay, so taking those two ideas, you're still wondering, okay, how are we going to get to economics? How are we going to get to economics? Did I miss my... Okay. I'm having trouble. You know what I'll do is look at your... There we go. Okay. I'm getting it back there. I'll get back there. Okay. So what does this have to do with economics? Economics, again, is studying choices under scarcity, under conditions of scarcity. There's only so many resources, and our job is to extract value for each other, right? And that affects the decisions we make are always trade-offs, right? We don't have anything that's unlimited, right? We have limited resources, and what is the best way to make the most people flourish in a godly way? Those are economic questions, and they require economic answers. And it's interesting that it also, the idea of creativity and exercising dominion or extracting value out of the earth, those two things together make the basis for how we interact with each other, right? Because we have, our creativity makes us do subjective things. So I'll give you, we have subjective value that we place on things that we did build or that we did create. And they don't, I'm not talking about necessarily in a business sense. So Ed, I'm going to pick on you, all right? Okay. All right, Ed creates music, right? So where do you get that? What do you use to do that?
Like practically or? Okay. I use like recording tools.
Oh, you have recording tools? So where'd you get them? So someone sold them to you? Where did they get it?
The manufacturer.
Or where'd he get it?
He got manufacturer down from the resources.
Oh, where'd he get it? Right, there you go. You follow it first. Someone built the things, your guitar, someone built, and they gave it to you. And they valued, what did you give? You don't have to tell me how much, but you gave them money, right? They valued the money that you had more than the guitar that they had, and the recording tools that they had, right? And that's a voluntary relationship, and that's how you interact with people, and that's good economics. We have subjective value that we place on things. Okay, so who here is not interested in economics? I have a free economics book. Who does not want it? You can be honest. Who doesn't want it? Come on. My wife does not want this book. All right. All right, who does want one? Ed, you'd like one? Okay. How much is it worth to you?
Here we go.
All right, who really wants one and it's worth at least something? Jared, how much is it worth to you?
It depends on what's in it, how much is in it.
It's like one of the most popular books on economics. Highly recommended.
You have to like scan through it, you know, because that's how you
Want to scan through it first? Okay, he's cautious. Let's say $1.
say what?
Let's say $1. That'll work?
Yep.
Okay, so Jenny has a book that she does not value at all. Jenny wants $1 though. So you guys voluntarily can get together and you can trade, and it's a win-win. No one loses in that kind of arrangement because we have creativity, we have subjective value that we place on things, right? So Cain and Abel, from the very beginning, Cain, he was a farmer, he did crops, he did wheat, right? Abel raised animals and plants and animals and was a farmer, right? And we needed animals to make a proper sacrifice, right? So Cain didn't have animals. How things were designed is Cain and Abel would have had a tighter bond. If Cain, the more productive he is, the more he produces crops, the more wheat he has, the less subjective value it is to him, the more he can give to Abel. Abel doing the same can trade him back. Cain could make a proper sacrifice. That's good economics. Bad economics is what happened when Cain just cracked Abel in the head, right? So that's bad economics. It's easy to apply on an individual basis, okay? But what I want to do is look at ways where it's a little more difficult to apply. And I want to try to go over as many of these 4 principles for stewardship, right? So these are not principles of stewardship. These aren't ways that you can be a good steward with your time and your energy. Those are important, and I'm not saying that. These are principles that optimize your ability and your culture's ability and your church's ability and your family's ability to be good stewards. So these are principles we should promote for ourselves and for others. Okay, and the first one is the principle of ownership. Ownership is critical, right? Who owns things? You own things? Tabitha? You own things? Okay, Psalm 24:1 tells us that God owns everything. Sorry, I tricked you. It's a trick question. He owns the earth and the fullness in it. God is the owner of everything. And our mandate, our cultural mandate, is to be stewards of what God owns. So your right to ownership is necessary in order for you to be a steward of what God gave you. If Scott owns something, he's right, and I don't have any rights to it because he's protecting it because he's a steward of what God gave him.
Would it be fair to say that those possessions are in my domain? Well, I mean, or dominion?
Yes.
Is that part of that?
Yes, yes. I think the ownership, the principle of ownership is critical for you to even be a steward, right? So these things are protected in the Bible very simply. Do not covet, do not steal. Ownership, you can't do those things because those people that you're coveting and trying to steal from have a mandate from God, and that's the things that God entrusted to them. They're using them, and it's their responsibility to make God-honoring decisions with those things. So, and Reagan talked about stewardship. He's talked about stewardship in different domains in our life. Stewardship of our body, stewardship of our time, stewardship of our resources. Those are all things that you own. And those are all things that you own because you're a steward and God gave them to you. Right? So those are very easy to apply in our own personal life. It's easy for me to see Kate and know that I'm not allowed to take her purse. Right? Right? That's easy to apply. It gets harder to apply as we aggregate to larger, you add 300 million people and we have a little bit of difficulty applying it. So here's some examples, and so feel free to jump in here. I don't have to finish all 4 of these points tonight. So a socialist is someone who doesn't believe in property rights, right? A communist doesn't believe in property rights. So can a socialist be a good steward? What's that? Right, he's abdicating what he owns, so he has nothing to steward, right? He might have time. If I take a person and put him in a jail cell, in a solitary confinement, and leave them there for 10 years, I choose when they eat, I take care of their health. Are they a good steward? I mean, they may be a great person, but they can't be a good steward because I've taken away their ability to steward anything. So here's an example where it gets interesting. I'm trying to figure out which of these to read. So when we get into large-scale examples, it's harder for us to see where those laws apply. So let's say there's a private utility company, and they have zillions of dollars. Fairly, they didn't make any laws to get that money. There's this example here. And they supply all of your utilities, but some people in your community lose their job because of the company closes. And you want to make a law, say, hey, the utility company can't shut off your electricity. Does that sound good? Be honest. Does that sound good or a bad law? It's not dissimilar from laws that are all over the place. Anybody think that's a good idea? Come on.
What was the question again?
Should
Good for me, Pat.
Utility company, they have lots of money. They supply your electricity. You lose your job. You have a family, and your electricity is going to get shut off. Should we force the utility company to keep giving you electricity?
No.
No, because then you get lazy.
Yeah? So what if you're not lazy? What if it's a legitimate need? Right.
When you take away that company's right to steward.
Yeah. And when you say taking away the company's right to steward, what do you mean by the company? Who's the company? A company is like an abstract idea. If you say, yeah, the company should still pay for electricity, and you know, these are examples we are already living under. There's no one can get their water cut off very easily. Go ahead, Charlie.
So how do we apply things like the 7 years like release, or like the 50-year jubilee, or like
Yeah.
or things like where you just give the leftovers to the poor and stuff? It's like kind of like welfare basically,
Yeah.
but like different because I don't know. How do we
Yeah,
apply that?
I think those are harder to apply because those are so specific to Israel
Yeah.
and God giving specific families, specific tribes, specific land, and having motives and reasons for keeping them there.
So
You
it's
know,
hard to
so
apply the
you
general
can get
idea.
all crazy and give away and gamble and give away your land. At the end of 50 years, it's all going to go back because God wants those people in that land. I don't know if we can apply that. There might be like things like Jubilee for debt relief and things like that might be things to be applied.
To cross the bridge here, you could say the company, say having a need there to develop a policy, kind of like Jubilee, where Israel was the company with a policy. Does that make sense?
I think so.
In a way, so like think of Israel as the company, and that's a policy.
Like
That
a
this
90-day
utility
grace
company could
period?
bring. What's that?
Like a 90-day grace period?
Yeah, maybe that's like, that would be a modern version of Jubilee, or like the gleaning of the crops. That's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
the Israeli policy of the company.
Randy?
But the interesting thing is you can see that in our economic system. If you have a bankruptcy, it comes off your credit report in 7 years.
Yeah, it's very similar, isn't it?
If you have any debt over, diminishing debt that has to get wiped off 7 years, no one knows about it anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I don't know if that was ever a law, or if that happened culturally and became a law, or if that was it happened as a law. I'm curious about that. Yeah, that's a good example. So when you talk about, let's say we say, yeah, the company should pay that because it would really be wrong to turn off people's electricity. When you say the company, who is it that you're talking about? This is an example of how things get complicated. A company isn't like, there's no person. Right.
It's a collection of people, so it's like you have a family. So if I say, we're just gonna make the Slickers cut our lawn, not just Steve Slicker, everyone at the Slicker's house is being affected.
Right, that's true.
So that's what a company is, it's
Yeah.
a collection of people.
Yep, yeah, exactly. When you say the company, you can say, well, I want, are you saying the customers? Like, I'm part of my utility company. I'm the customer, are you saying, oh, the customer should all just chip in and pay for it? Right? And if you make that a law, you have to come to some justification for how that's not stealing. Say, no, I don't mean the customers, because I'm one of the customers, and I just lost my job too. Right? Okay, well then I mean the employees. Do you mean the employees? Should the employees have to chip in? Should we steal from the employees to pay for it? Right? Is that what we mean? Say, no, I don't want the employees. Employees probably like, most of them are scraping by. Maybe someone would say, I only want the rich employees to pay for it. Right? Or would you say, I want the stockholders. I want the people who back the company, the people who have it in their 401k. I want them to pay for it. And again, that comes back around to the same people. Probably the guy that lost his job, if he has a 401k, has that company in it. And if it's not that company, it's another company going through the same kind of thing. So it's a little bit misplaced. Hopefully you can see that as an example where it's easy to say, oh, I shouldn't steal something from Ed or whatever. But when it aggregates, it feels like it gets more complicated, although in fact it is. If you're ever making a law that's taking money from one person to another, it's not any different than if I'm taking something from Ed. Okay, so principle of ownership. So I'm going to probably only do this one because I like to keep talking about it. So instead of trying to go on to another one. So we can go on to our camping meeting. So let's look at the question if it was a private company, but what if it's a public company? What if it's the state that runs the utility company? Dustin?
So we're paying taxes that support this company then?
Well, that's the question. What if it's a public company?
Yeah, so we are paying utilities, plus we are paying taxes to run this company, is that right? So like we pay for our water, but also 6% of our stuff goes to this company, New York, Texas.
I don't know. I didn't think that far ahead in the analogy.
Well, see, that's what I'm asking, because like, it kind of makes a difference, because if it's just a public-run company and we're not paying tax, like directly paying tax, we're just paying through what we use, then I'd say no, but if we are still paying taxes, so we're just like, so 6% of what we buy down the road goes to this over here, then that might change things, because like we're still paying it indirectly.
Yeah. But maybe we're changing. I would suggest that what the difference between public and private isn't the same way a company is an abstract idea, and it ends up being people in different relationships and under different contracts. A nation is the same thing. And a nation is bound morally the same way you and I are as individuals. So let's take a look at 1 Kings 21, and I'll try to just finish up here in the next 10 minutes. So 1 Kings 21 is about King Ahab. And King Ahab was not a very good king, and he kind of fell in love with the vineyard of this guy named Naboth. And he went to a Naboth, this is 1 Kings 21, and he told him, hey, I really want your vineyard, sell it to me. And Naboth said, no, this is like my family vineyard. It's my inheritance. I'm not going to sell you my vineyard. Right? But Ahab is the king. Ahab is the government. Ahab's the guy. He can do whatever he wants. And what he did instead, in verse 4, is he went to bed and cried and turned away his face and wouldn't eat any food. But his wife came to the rescue, and she said, listen, if you want that vineyard, you're the king. I will get the vineyard for him. So in verse 7, do you now govern Israel? Arise and eat bread and let your heart be cheerful. I will get the vineyard for you. So she writes letters, and she basically says, let's get two bad guys at Naboth together in front of everybody, and we'll have the two bad guys say that Naboth committed a crime, and then we'll kill him, and then we'll take his vineyard. Right? So there's like bearing false witnesses, coveting, bearing false witnesses, murder, and then stealing his vineyard. He got like 4 commandments all in one episode. Right? But he's the king. So can the king steal? Or is the king allowed to take what he wants? And verse 19 tells us the answer. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who's in Samaria. Behold, he's in the vineyard of Naboth. The vineyard still belongs to Naboth, even though Ahab took it, where he has gone to take possession. And say to him this, thus says the Lord, have you killed, and have you also stolen? So can the state steal? Yes, right? The state can steal, just like you and I can steal. So I would suggest that the same moral principles need to apply, whether it was a private or a public company. And so we don't have a king. So it's easy to see how a king can be bad. Can democracy steal? Yes, yes. In a democracy, who is sovereign?
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Nobody and everybody, right? You are in charge. In a democracy, you're the one choosing the king. You're the one choosing the rules. So if you're not interested in economics and you don't care about policies, please don't vote so that my vote counts a little more. Right? Because in a democracy, you're actually responsible for the moral actions of the government that they're not leading us, you put them there. And that's hard, because when your vote is one of 300 million, it doesn't feel very weighty, but it's actually a very weighty responsibility. I'm not gonna try to press on anymore. Is there any questions about that one? And I don't have any need to get through too many of those. I've got 3 weeks, so.
I have a,
Dustin?
So are taxes still unfavorable, would you say?
Well, that's the question. Are taxes stealing, and are taxes always stealing? Can taxes be stealing? Yes, right? So I'm not going to try to answer that question, but I want you to be aware that the state can steal. And if you own something, it's possible that the state can steal from it. And if they're taking it to give it to someone else that doesn't, and that someone needs it, that's not a good moral justification. So you should find some other moral justification. So I have an example of how the world is designed for ownership. Now, the next time we'll talk a little bit about the effects of the fall. And this is the last thing I want to share. And this is about China, right? So in 1970s, about the same time as China, you were doing Trump?
No,
About the same time that Norman Borlaug was making the food supply work for everybody, China had no.
You're talking about the Great Beat Forward and with mounted on.
I'm talking about four farmers.
Oh,
Okay, it's right at the same time, right?
yeah, I know.
Okay, yeah, this is the source for that. Great, so China had no property rights, completely communist, right? So in a village called Xiaogang, Zaigang, there was a small farming village, and four farmers gathered in a mud hut to sign a secret contract. This is only 1978, right? This is recent, well, from my perspective. They thought it might get them executed. Instead, it ended up transforming China's economy, right? Because at this point, China has no concept of ownership of private property. So the contract was risky. I'll try not to just read the whole thing. It was created at the height of communism in China. And the economy of China in the 70s was near nothing, right? Every straw, the farmer says, one of the farmers says, back then, even one straw belonged to the group. He was a farmer, no one owned anything. At one meeting with Communist Party officials, the farmer asked, what about the teeth in my head? Do I own those? The answer, no. Your teeth belong to the collective. In theory, the government would take what the collective grew and would also distribute food to each family. That sounds good, right? Distribute food. The distribution part sounds like it could be good. Work hard, don't work hard, everyone gets the same. In Zaigang, there was never enough food, and the farmers often had to go to other villages to beg. Their children were going hungry, and they were desperate. So in the winter of 1978, after a terrible harvest, they came up with an idea. Rather than farm as a collective, each family would get to farm its own plot of land. If the family grew a lot of food, the family could keep some of the harvest. It's an old idea, of course, but it's a new idea in China. So one evening they snuck into one of the farmers' home. Like all the houses, they didn't have any plumbing or electricity. The reason it says that is because they said this contract is like a high voltage wire. They thought whenever you touched it, they're going to get electrocuted, and that's what they thought would happen with coming up with this contract. So the farmers agreed to divide up the land among the families. Each family agreed to turn over some of what they grew to the government and to the collective. And crucially, the farmers agreed that families that grew enough food would get to keep some for themselves. The contract also recognized the risk the farmers were taking. If any of the farmers were sent to prison or executed, then part of their contract was that the others in the group would care for their children under age 18. The farmers tried to keep the contract secret. He hid it inside a piece of bamboo in the roof of his house, but when they returned to the fields, everything was different. So the same land was being farmed, the same tools, the same people, yet just changing the economic rules by saying you get to keep some of what you grow, everything changed. At the end of the season, they had an enormous harvest, more than in the previous 5 years combined. So what happened is the Communist Party was kind of changing their view. So instead of these guys got caught doing this, And instead of getting executed, they ended up getting kind of praised in a relative communistic sense. And the contract that they had ended up getting put in the museum. But the revolution that happened is that it's not like China became a capitalist society. It's not like there really is a capitalist society. It's not like that happened, but they did begin recognition of ownership rights. And that changed. This Chinese economy has skyrocketed ever since. They have a stock market. It's still communist, and they take a lot from people. But it's interesting that just the idea of ownership of each man, even if they're atheists, right? The idea, the way God created things, is that everyone's going to have the domain, and you have the right to your domain, and you need the right because that's how you are held responsible for it, which is going to kind of get into our next principle. But I'm only going to try to do one.